Hey, everyone, and welcome back to Embracing Your Virtue. I am your host, Samantha Jasmine, and welcome back to our show. For those of you who might be joining for the first time, Embracing Your Virtue is my channel dedicated to women of color in the Christian faith, where we talk about all things related to women that empower them, related to careers, children, faith, etc. So, in honor of Women's History Month, I wanted to profile some women that I know who are awesome women who are making a difference in their careers, boss chicks. And with me today is my good friend Joanna Rouse. Joanna, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sam. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to have you. And today we're going to talk about women in technology, in particular, Black women in technology. As everybody knows, technology is the growing field. We can't do anything without technology. So we're going to talk about that today and just talk about what it looks like for Black women in that field and how we can empower Black women towards STEM careers. So, Joanna, why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about your career background and what you're currently doing?
Yeah, for sure. So I did go to school for marketing. That was what I went to college for. And I started my career right out of college in marketing and branding, partnerships, client relations for a lot of fashion retail companies. And I learned a lot. I loved a good sample sale. I worked at Juicy Couture for a while back when they were in their heyday, and with fashion brands like Burberry, Joe Fresh. And it was great. I learned a lot. But it wasn't really fulfilling, all as much fulfilling for a time, but it wasn't really fulfilling after a couple of years. So while I was working, I was able to volunteer with organizations like Just for Success that were making an impact. So I got that bug of wanting to kind of do more what I like to do, marketing, but doing it for good, and more like cause marketing. So I knew I wanted to use my marketing skills for something that I was passionate about as well. So I started exploring opportunities for that. And when I had separated from my last retail marketing position and I wasn't working for a time, I was still using my skills to, consult and volunteer in small capacities. And while I was looking, I had a checklist. I was like, I know I want my next company to be diverse. I know I want to be able to make an impact. I want to be able to mentor and feel fulfilled. So those were kind of the top things that I was looking for. And nothing really resonated with me. And then I was like, oh, bills are coming. I'm like, I need to find something quick. And a family friend, she was working at Npower, the company I currently work for. And she said, hey, there's an open marketing position. Is it something you're interested? And I never had worked in nonprofit space. It's always been for profit. But I started the interview and things were checking off my list while I was going through the process. And I knew it was God. I was like, this is where I should be. So I started working for them and I love it. I really, really love what I do. It's basically a national nonprofit that basically connects veterans and young adults to tech careers. So I do the marketing for them and basically raise awareness for it. So it was really just a nice way to combine what I love to do, as well as making an impact and giving back.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So let's talk a little bit about that. So I love the fact that you didn't necessarily have a STEM background, but in looking at an organization that empowers, young people of color to enter into this lucrative and growing field, you are able to use your marketing background to still promote this organization, which I think is pretty awesome. Um, and just working at Empower, what have you learned about like the percentage of tech jobs that are occupied by women?
Yeah, it's actually really startling and it's really kind of disheartening at times. Women actually make up 26% of technology jobs right now. So women as a whole, right? And so this is according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but only 3% of them are Black, right? Are Black
Wow.
women.
Just three?
3%.
Wow.
And then for Latinx or Hispanic women, it's 1%.
Wow.
So if you look at that pie of how many technology jobs there are, and then if you think about, I think Microsoft, they released another report recently that there would be about 13 million digital or technology related jobs by 2025. Yeah, everybody's mouth should drop.
Yeah, we need to get some of that.
That's my point. So it's like there is this big pool there is open jobs. We know the field is growing, especially now with the pandemic and people working from home, right? So we know there's a need. And then there's organizations like Npower that are giving, people of color, especially women of color, these skills, these tech skills to find these jobs, or and other companies that are doing things like that, right? Or other women of color that are researching their own, that are going to college for these types of careers. So it's like, it looks like it would be a match made in heaven, but you see that it's discrepancy right there of companies that they're looking for talent, but the talent is often right there, and it's still not, being matched. So that's a problem.
Wow. Yeah. So let's talk about why that is. Why are there so few women of color, in particular Black and Latina women of color in the tech field?
Yeah, I mean, there could be a couple of reasons, and every kind of situation could be a little different, or everybody has kind of a special case. But I think from the work that we're doing at Npower, what I kind of see from the trainees that come into our program and how we go on to place them, and kind of the reporting that we've seen in our process and what we've seen on our end is one, personal could be financial obligations, right? So we had a survey that we took of just our trainees that have gone through the program, and seeing kind of what are some of the top barriers for them that they've self-reported. And you see about 66% of the women in our program versus 59% of the men basically attribute financial instability or lack of financial resources as their top reason why they might, drop out of college or stop the program, right? So that's huge. Financial resources.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then caregiving responsibilities is another top one. So for females specifically, that's something that is always a challenge, for them is, hey, I'm taking care of, maybe a sick parent or a child. So that also can cause, some issues as well for them to further their career or further in tech as well. So it's kind of just like a balance between surviving their present conditions versus preparing for the future, right? So that's really a top one that we see.
Yeah, yeah, no, I mean that makes sense. And women are more likely to be caregivers for sick relatives. We are
Yeah,
more likely to be the ones to stay at home with our kids.
that's it.
So, we are more likely to, our uptake is more likely to be slower than our male counterparts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then some other ones are, lack of representation. I think that's a huge, huge one that,
Yeah.
it's starting to get talked about
Mhm.
more. But we really found, again, in just the work that we do every day and what we see and the stories we hear, and, because we're kind of a bridge, right? So Npower kind of sits between training for diverse talent and then placing at um, Fortune 500 companies or partners that we work with to place our students. So we kind of see, we kind of sit in the middle, right? So we're working with these corporations to say, hey, you're saying that you want diverse talent, tech talent, and you don't have it. Here we are providing for it, but you need to know how to work with these diverse populations. So lack of representation, I think, is huge, starting in the schools, right? So starting young, right? Because this is not just a woman of color. This is starting from a young girl of color.
Right.
She grows, right?
Mhm.
So lack of representation in schools, a lot of the trainees or students that we interviewed, they're like, well, none of my math or STEM or science teachers they didn't look anything like me. So at the front of the class, they didn't see anybody that looked like them. And then that translates as they go into college or alternative path like Npower, and that's kind of a big thing, is we want to have instructors that look the part, right, like them, so they can see some of that representation. But then you get to the workplace and it's back to that, right?
Yeah. So when you were growing up, when you went to school,
Yep.
or when you were just coming up, like, was there like a general knowledge that you've gotten either from school or from your family about like opportunities in STEM? Because I feel like for me, other than like being a doctor,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like you can be a doctor, or you can be some type of inventor, or like you can be like, even in math jobs, like I didn't know of any math jobs outside of like finance and accounting. It
Yeah.
was like you either did that or you became a math teacher.
Right.
So like but there's so many other opportunities for science and technology and math and all those other things, but I just had no idea about what those were. I don't know if you had a similar experience.
Yeah, that's so big. I think that point, for me, it was a little weird. It was a little different how I grew up, because I grew up in a very traditional Christian family. So us our more of the aspirations was like, well, whatever God wants you to do. So that's very very vague and very wide. So I know some cultures it's like you need to be a doctor, a lawyer,
Yes.
or a doctor or a lawyer, and that's
Right.
it. There was no options, right?
Yeah.
Or, I know some of my friends were like, oh, my dad had a family business. He wanted me to run that, right? So there's different scenarios. For me, I feel like growing up, it was more of, you want to go to college, right? I mean, it wasn't, again, thankfully, I didn't feel like the pressure of you have to go to college, become a doctor. There was something for working in financial stability, so finding a career in that.
Right.
But it wasn't really, it was kind of me figuring out my own path and what kind of attracted me. So again, I know that's not everybody's story, but for me, I feel like I almost had the opposite. I didn't really have a direction of which one to choose. Like it wasn't doctor shoved down, but it wasn't also like creative. Like it was just
just open-ended.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's the best way, but that's how it was for me.
Yeah. Well, at least it wasn't limiting, Yeah.
So even now it's like, I think that what you also brought up is the options, right? And then there's it's not only one thing, and that's something else too, that a lot of, back to the barriers, is that a lot of times women of color specifically think that when you say tech, it is only coding, or it is only, downloading databases, or, some really intense tech position. And it's not always like that, right?
Yeah.
There's so many things you can do in it. The healthcare, we have a lot of students that come, they want to go into healthcare eventually, or they want to do music engineering, or they want to do, fashion, or social service. Like there's so many outlets. And again, every job is a tech job soon, because it has some component of tech skills in there. So
Right. And I think that's so important to be able to highlight those different type of jobs, because for so long, for me, a tech job was, I'm either like a coder, like you said, or I'm like an IT help desk. Like that was like
only two.
And I was just like, well, neither of those are pretty interesting to me, like
that's it.
But that was it. But there's so much more to it. Like, and I think it's really cool. Like even just looking at like there's so many different types of engineering. And like you can do so much with that, or I think about like I had no idea what an actuary was, right? And how that's used until I started working in HR in the benefits section, right? And so like we hire these actuaries to like crunch numbers for us to help us to understand like trends in healthcare, to help us to understand like how much things are going to cost, like how much we should be charging people for medical premiums, all these different type of things, right? And I was like, man, like your job is to just play with numbers all day. And I used to love math in school, right? But I did not, other than like I loved math in school. And so I thought finance was kind of the next career path for that. But then when you get into college and you study finance, it's less about the actual numbers. It's all about concept. And I was like, well, this is not the same thing, and I had no exposure to like what actuarial science was or anything else, and like where that could go.
So and there's so much out there too.
Yeah. Absolutely. So like, how can we what can parents do to encourage interest in STEM fields for their kids? Like you and I both have girls, how can we from an early age, make this like a norm for them? Well, I think just to back up too, I think another kind of barrier is still this like long lasting stereotype about women and math, right? And math and science fields. And like we just don't have the brain capability to handle those type of jobs. And I think that's like a long lasting stigma, right? And like I hear so many women like instinctively like, oh, I hate math. And it just makes me wonder, like, do you hate it? Like, is part of the reason why you hate it because you like, one, probably didn't have good teachers, or
Yes.
two, like you were never encouraged to like it because you're a woman.
But that is so, I mean, you hit the nail on the head with that, because I think even the way that it is even marketed, like, most of the STEM, like if you think about the STEM toys or where they're positioned even in stores, like it really all ties back to that, and whether it's conscious or unconscious. But even to the fact, like, I remember saying math was my least favorite subject, right? Like I didn't like math, and where does that come from? And even like you said with my daughter Kaya, it's like math is something that we're working through, and and she loves science, but it's like that math, and it's just where does that come from? And you have to work almost so hard to engineer that narrative or turn it around, right? Like, okay, you might have a challenge, but you can get through it, right? So like figuring out a way around it, because it's so true. I think for kids, it starts, you don't even kind of know where it is, but it's like just somewhere that comes, that girls especially think that it's complicated or hard. And it's hard because as you grow into your career and in these tech spheres, hence the stats, it turns almost into a boys club or a male-dominated field.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of just mirrors what is actually happening, So it's tough.
Yeah. And do you think that it's a male-dominated field? Do you feel like that stereotype is one of the reasons why more women of color, or more women and women of color, are not hired into the STEM field? Like it's just that old boys club thing?
For sure. I think, of course there's strides that are being made, and people are making strides, and there's women that are breaking through, and you can see all these things happening. But I think overall it's still such a tight-knit boys club, and the reason I know this is just because our students tell us, right? So you might have a student that is placed at X company, right? And they're in, say, engineering or software development, and they're like, I'm the only girl and person of color on my team, and it can be hard. I mean, we'll probably get to this later, but it's hard to stay in that kind of environment and feel like you can thrive, So it's just, it is a boys club. I'm saying, not to say that it's not being, strides are not being made, but it's still very much, and you think in Silicon Valley, it's still very much that kind of affinity.
Yeah. So like what, let's talk about tech companies, right? Just from your experience working at Npower, like what are tech companies doing, or what can they do to make their industry more inclusive for Black women and other women of color?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is a big one. And again, like even our company has been kind of trying to give the organizations and companies that we work with guides and tools of how to do this work, right? Because we're not saying it's easy, but it can be done if you're willing to put in the work. So I think one thing is even just the hiring process, and you probably know this better than anybody, but even from entry, right? So again, students research too as well, but I know this firsthand from our students and hearing it. I mean, there is things such as name bias, right? So sending your resume in, whether it's to a system or actually, to a person, and it's like, they don't, that name, whoever that Black person's name, or, whether it's a man or a woman, but just a person of color, and that name they don't recognize, or, sometimes the system kind of takes it out. So there's so many different issues there. There was a study that they had done of, two resumes, one with like maybe a more Afrocentric name versus another, maybe, what they call a regular standard name. And they could see the differences in people calling back for interviews, right? So again, these are unconscious biases, even colleges, right? So you look down to see where that person went to college. They go through a non-traditional training program that somebody doesn't recognize, but they recognize Harvard or something else. Not to say that person's more qualified than the other, but it just starts there, even in the hiring process,
Right. Yeah. And I mean, Npower falls into that category of like a non-traditional training process, right?
For sure.
So can you talk more about that? Like, how, especially I think for people who may want to enter that industry, but
Mhm.
maybe they don't have the finances for a 4-year college,
Yeah.
or the time for a 4-year college. Like, are there opportunities for people who don't have formal college degrees in tech fields?
For sure. I think what is interesting now, what's happening, you see happening more, is that people are, especially in a field like tech, you can get certifications and kind of work your way up. We just, there was an article that we had, one of our partners who's on our board, he works at Bank of America, but he didn't have a college degree, but he had certifications and he worked his way up. So, nowadays it's not as common, but in that tech industry, the luxury of that is that you can get experience, you can get certifications, and that's kind of what the trainees in our program come. A lot of them don't have college degrees, but they come into their program and they're able to be placed and starting with 40K, not having a college degree, right? And so that's not the route for everybody,
Right.
but for the population we serve, there is a place for you in tech if you're able to, because certification base is really big in tech, and knowing more of what you're doing and knowing how to work these systems rather than having a 4-year college degree.
Right, right. We're like, oh, you had to take philosophy and, a bunch of other courses that are
Exactly.
valuable in other areas of life, but not necessarily in what gets you paid, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think that's big. I think also, something else companies can do. We talked about their hiring process, but I think it's even after that too. It's once they're hired,
Mhm.
when you're hired, that retaining them is really big.
Yeah.
So I know that's a lot of what our company does, works with the companies that our students are placed at to kind of monitor that, how, at least for the first couple of months, how are they adjusting to the culture, and different things that you don't think of. They got the job, okay, great. But even the number, that disparity of numbers, is because sometimes people of color are exiting out of the tech industry once they're in,
Yeah.
right? And it can be dependent on so many different reasons, but definitely having those mentors, sponsors, advocates while they're in this new companies, especially somebody starting, they might not have, professional background, it can be an adjustment for them, when they're
Right.
getting into these Fortune 500 companies. So
Yeah.
I think that's also something, is just kind of figuring out how to retain. So I think
Mhm.
companies need to do better work with that, right? Because if diversity is a priority,
Right.
you'll prioritize making sure you have the resources to retain the
Right.
talent.
Yeah, and that's, oh man, I was talking about this with Mia Torreira, who's a guest on my show earlier this month.
I heard her.
And
It was great.
yeah, I think one of the things that resonated with me was when I asked her, like, what was the hardest challenge about coming out of law school, and she talked about, the challenge of adjusting to corporate America, right? And just the idea, and I'm like, I've been there, just how much of that has actually nothing to do with the actual work itself,
Yeah,
and how much it has to do with just culture and environment and personality and social norms that can
yes,
definitely isolate people of color, women, immigrants, people of certain religious affiliations, and in certain and people of certain financial standing, you
that's
know,
it. Yeah,
and so it's like, okay, even when you get in there, it's like you don't want to feel like the black sheep of the company, and like feel like that's gonna kind of label you. Yeah.
and it's hard. Like, I think you talked about that culture, and like, even something simple as, you know coming to work and saying, oh, what did you do on the weekend? Did you go golfing? Like, no, I did not go golfing, right? So like, it's just even things like that, where again, maybe they're not doing it as to be overt and isolating, or feeling, or making that person feel ostracized.
Right.
But it's just, it is something that you have to be mindful of when you're when you're doing diverse hiring, and realizing that everybody's background is not the same. Everybody
Right.
didn't have that luxury of that. So
Exactly. Yeah.
I that's that culture fit, it's super, it's a real thing, and we hear it a lot.
Yeah, Joanna, is there any other things that you feel like can be done to help make tech industries more inclusive for women?
Yeah, I think I mean, of course, there's a couple of, different things that they can change in practices, but I think one other thing is, now with everybody kind of joining this, let's make diversity inclusion a focus, right? Diversity and inclusion and leaving out the belonging, because you need all three. You need
Yes.
diversity, inclusion, and belonging.
See, you don't hear about belonging too often.
Everybody forgets about that.
Yeah, that's important. Wow.
That's super important. The
Yeah.
diversity, inclusion, and belonging. Like, you can't have diversity and inclusion without belonging, because that's when you don't retain the talent that you just hired in.
Mm.
And so I think, especially for companies that are, I guess, have this push. Goldman Sachs just had I think they made, I can't remember the exact number, don't quote me, but it's about $100 million, I think they pledged, or maybe it was $10 million to affect 100 women. I have to look at the stats again, but Goldman Sachs put a big proclamation out there that they were going to do more for Black women specifically. They had a whole big report. And so a lot of these companies are doing these grand gestures, which are great on paper. I think because, my company actually is doing the work,
Yeah.
our fear is making sure this is not just lip service, and actually putting the work in to do what you're saying, So I think that's something for companies. If you're really trying to make your company more inclusive, it has to be authentically done. It can't just be like, oh, I'm putting $100 million behind this initiative, or I'll give money there. The money is great, but that money is not going to really help you when you're bringing people in, then they still feel that there's not really authenticness behind you wanting to have a diverse company, right? And so I think that's my fear is, if these companies are really putting their mouth where their money is.
Yeah. Hopefully, right? And I think that it's our job to keep them accountable and to continue to expose it and bring it out.
That's it.
Like they always have these like diversity surveys and like great place to work surveys that we would have to fill out, right? And it's like there's a lot of pressure to have these like great diversity scores and inclusiveness scores. And when you're working there and in certain places I've been in, it's a different picture than what's reported. And I think it has a lot to do with like, okay, yeah, you may have a lot of people of color, but what level are all those people? Are they all entry level?
That's it.
Are they all on the production site? How many
Yes.
managerial and executive level positions do you have?
And board. Don't
And
forget about the board.
Yes, and board, right? Positions do you have people of color, and particularly women of color, in those fields, right? And like, how do those people who work in there really feel about working here? That belonging piece is a big deal.
Huge,
Yeah.
huge deal. Like I even know when another one of the things on my checklist when I came to Npower was I had never had a woman of color as a boss, right? So my VP right now, she is African American.
Nice.
She lives in Bed-Stuy, so it's just having that connection. Again, I had great bosses in the past, nothing against them, but it just was different seeing, a woman of color as a VP. So I just my relationship with her and everything, it's just feels different, but in a good way, in a good difference. So it really is important and it does make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to circle back to the conversation we were having, because I think we started it about, as parents of Black daughters, what can we do to encourage an interest in STEM related fields?
Yeah, this is a big one. You did mention it actually before. Something that I had thought is a big one for parents is exposure. You had mentioned exposure, and I think that is really at least half the battle, right? Having them exposed to these types of options early on and knowing that this could be turning into something that's a viable career. As parents, I know for Kai, I'm like, oh, I want her to learn another language. I want her to do music or ballet, and that's all great and needed. But in the same way, having that exposure to, it doesn't have to be coding. I know there's so many coding programs, and that's sexy and hot right now. But there, there's other STEM activities and projects. She watches a show on Netflix called MC Squared, and it's about girls combining science and fashion. So they have a line in Target that you can find, and it's like bath bombs, right? That you put, the different powders together and they tell you what they are. And then you make a bath bomb out of them, or, different lipsticks and you put it together, so just making it fun for them if they have an interest to that, right? And some kids may not be, but if you do see that and if you see they're interested, it's good to kind of fuel that at this age. So, she likes the shows, she likes, seeing the girls, and then you go to Target, the products are there to do, and they position it in a really fun way and package it well that it piques her interest.
Yeah.
There's also free STEM camps as well that I know some parents, one of my friends, she put her daughter, it was like a couple of weeks, but it was a free STEM camp that they have, and they do activities and robotics and different things like that. So that's also nice. And I think the last thing is just explaining to, sometimes when kids are talking about what you want to be when you grow up, that tech and can be a viable career, and it doesn't have to be only, your mom or your grandparents' tech, right? It's their social media is big and digital, right? There's so many graphic designer. There's so many different ways you could do tech now. And even if you are a nurse, lawyer, teacher, you can combine things, right? There's a cross-sectionality between, you can be just a technician in a hospital. You don't have to be a nurse or a doctor. So I think there's just having that and showing them that it can be a viable career if they so choose, because having your parents' support in your career is big. And if more parents are kind of encouraging that it's, careers, it's opportunity for advancement, it's flexible, and kind of showing the benefits as they get older of why technology could be a career path. There's a lot of open jobs, right? It's a pandemic. We're in our economy is crazy, but we know that technology, people are still hiring for that.
So. Right. Yeah, that's so important. It makes me think about an article I read a while back, and it was about Black women in technology. And one of the things they said is like a big reason. Well, they said one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of women in STEM related jobs is that even that there's a large portion of Black women who studies, let's just say computer programming or computer science, that end up changing their major. So they never actually make it to the end. And they listed a lot of reasons. They talked about, discrimination practices, even in the college level. But one of the things they said that I thought was interesting is they said that Black women are more likely to go into social sciences, right? Like they're more likely to go into teaching, social work, psychology, fields that revolve around helping people where they can see a more direct impact. And I thought that was really interesting. I'm like, well, I could totally get that. And I'm like, I wonder if there is a way to show that you can use your tech degree to still work for things that still help people. Does that make sense?
That is it. That's it. And that's super big because people it's just bringing awareness to that, right? So you can find ways to do that, even if you want to do things with community. We had one trainee, our student was like, oh, I want to, be able to learn these tech skills so I can go back into my community and, help create a food bank, or, so you can do these things. And I think it's not an either or. If you have these tech skills that you get, you can use them in different ways. It doesn't say that you have to use them, as you said, in tech. Just having that in your background or in your back pocket makes you more marketable as well. Right? So even if you're going to a social services role and it's, maybe a smaller mid-sized nonprofit and you're, social worker or whatever your job is and you're doing, helping people. If you have those skills, you're able to help them launch, their first website. There's so many things that you can do in it that could just make you more marketable. It's almost like a second language push, right?
Right.
That's what it kind of equates to now in our society,
Yeah. Oh, that's so true. It makes me think about, there's so many like school districts that I know who's like, their processes are still so antiquated. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, why isn't this automated? Why can't I do this online? What, and I'm like, think about what would it look like to use that to like revolutionize how things are done in like poor performing school districts and to make things more self-service and easier for parents. Like, what would that look like in like what would it look like for you to build an app that like connects Black people to Black therapists, or like,
They
like there's so many ways that you can use tech to help people. I think we just have to see that, and like you said, like present those options to our kids.
That's it. Because they won't know unless you show them or tell them,
Right.
or they'll get it when they get older. And by that time, they might have already made the decision. So that it just goes back to the exposure of just presenting the options,
Yeah.
So
Yeah, absolutely. So as we wrap up, I wanted to ask, what advice would you give to other Black women who want to get into a technology field, or to Black women who are in the field and trying to navigate their way?
yeah, I think for me, I call myself a non-tech techie, because
Mhm.
um, I do tech adjacent work, right? So I'm
Right.
marketing, but I do a lot of things that obviously take platforms and systems and different things like that. And the company I work with is a tech-ish nonprofit.
Right.
But I think one thing that I found really helpful for me, because I'm still growing in my career, was surrounding myself with a tech focused, well, Black tech focused communities. And there's so many that exist now, that I wouldn't have known unless I, obviously was in this industry now, and I'm kind of more looking for it. It's finding me, and I'm finding those kind of communities. But there's an organization called Bridges in Tech, and they basically they have newsletters, they have virtual happy hours, they all this online, of course, but they do just these communities, to support Black women in tech, because they know that they're very few and far between. There was a conference I attended today, obviously virtually, by LinkedIn. It was called Transform Her. And basically the chief marketing officer is a woman of color, and she spoke there. Some other leaders in tech were there. So just finding those communities that are supporting Black women in tech, right? Because it is a really niche market. There's another one called For Colored Girls Who Tech. So finding these kind of communities that you're able to know about new resources, just feel like you're not alone in this, and that either you're trying to get into the community and need support and tools and tips and tricks of how to get in, or if you're already in the community and you just want reinforcement that that's where you need to be, it's helpful, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Another thing I would say is taking advantage of free and cost-effective self-learning platforms. So obviously there's, programs, like I said, like Npower. There's other programs that do the same, very similar work that are free. But then there's also, self-learning platforms like LinkedIn courses, Coursera, General Assembly, Google certifications now have their own type of different tech training certifications that you can get from Google, even the public library as well. I took actually coding classes for free at the public library. I'm not going to be a coder, but they offered it, and I took them, and they had some other free technology classes. So I think learning is more accessible, and you can do it easily, wherever you fall, whether you have a job already and you're trying to just upskill, or you're trying to break into tech. Those free training courses are everything, and can really put something to put on your resume, knowledge that you can get as you're trying to grow in your career. So I think those are the two big ones, is taking advantage of those resources that are available, that are free out there.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you. Joanna, this was awesome. Let's wrap up by telling everyone, how can we find more information about Npower if we either want to register as a student or even donate to the good work that they're doing there?
For sure. So you can go to npower.org. So that's NPOWER.org. And you can, our social handles are on there as well. If you'd like to follow us, learn more about our programs, find ways to support, monitor, or otherwise, it's all there.
Awesome. This was a great discussion, and this makes me want to go learn something about technology.
Yay!
I'm like, listen, I'm struggling just to figure out Instagram. So I need to go find out what my public library is offering. so that I can work this thing out and
Be surprised what
yeah.
they have there. They have got a lot of good resources, and they're
Yeah.
free.
Yeah, because in a minute I'm going to be asking my kids and they're 6. So
Yeah, they know. They know.
yeah.
Well,
But
thank you for having me, Sam. This has been great. I
yes,
appreciate
thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for listening. Please be sure to follow me on social media. You can follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Embracing Your Virtue. If you like what you're hearing, please go to iTunes, leave me a rating and a comment. Check out my website, www.embracingyourvirtue.com. You can find my podcast there, my written blogs, and just other helpful resources. And stay tuned in 2 weeks for our next podcast. Thanks and God bless. Bye.